Welcome to the Amber Nectar podcast, discussing the things we think about Hull City AFC.
Welcome along to the Amber Nectar podcast. Feels like it's been forever. As you can see, Andy and Les are here. It's been a long time. It has been a long time since we've spoken to you. But we are back, as you can see, if you're watching us live on Periscope or later on via our YouTube page. And we have a new laptop. Remember, it was laptop knack that caused the last podcast to be horribly delayed, although we did get something online in the end. But it does mean that you can download us in audio-only form from your podcast provider. So we've had 2 home games in the last 4 days. 1 point from 6, no goals scored. I suppose we could look at it that we've still only lost 1 game in, 5 or 6 now, Andy? But ultimately we have to look at the Nottingham Forest game as a really hideous low for the season, even taking the context of the reasonably good run of results City have had around it.
Yeah, it was horrendous, wasn't it? City they weren't even close to being at the races. They didn't even appear to know that there were any races or what a race might be, or any kind of race-related ignorance that you want to provide for City, because they were just absolutely abject from the first minute for pretty much the entire match. It's quite tempting, isn't it, to try to explain it away as the product of an individual's mistake in the second half that gifts the opposition the goal. But I think that I wouldn't want us to go down that route, because it suggests that we were somehow unlucky and that somehow the victims of our own one-off misfortune. But there was a lot more to it than that. City were awful for the whole game, and the surprise is that it took an individual error to put us behind, because it felt like it had been coming from the kick-off.
You can have a right good laugh if City play as badly as that and still get away with a point, especially against a side who are so evidently better as Forest were. But ultimately it became about defensive brain farts again, just like the Birmingham game prior to the international break. And it sounds like a bit of a paradox, but City are rather good at those, aren't they?
Exceptionally good, yeah. It's our key skill this season, I think. Yeah, I feel for your device, I really do. I mean, I perhaps have more tolerance of him than perhaps I do other players that make mistakes. I don't know why that is. I sort of feel for him. You get the feeling he's really putting a lot of effort in to try and impress that City. But Andy's right. Although it was an individual error that led to us going a goal behind, but City were behind in so many other ways. Well ahead of that. Nottingham Forest had 61% of possession at the K-Com Stadium, and it felt like a home game for them. I was particularly bemoaning the fact that we played 4-4-2. I know you get a lot of people that get really married to 4-4-2 in England, where they can't seem to fathom that playing one up front doesn't have to be negative if you flood 5 midfielders forward when you've got the ball. It only needs to be one up front when you don't have it. And because we're not that good, and because we don't have great strength and depth in the squad, it meant that when we didn't have the ball, we then had 2 players pretty much stranded that were useful. As you said the other day, Andy, 20% of our outfield players were then taken out of the game because neither Campbell or Martin have the mobility to then sprint back and get behind the ball. So they weren't involved in the defending. So Forest were just sort of like merrily passing the ball around, sort of strolling forward. It was as easy an away game as a team can have.
And yet it took a comparatively late defensive error well into the second half for Forest to actually break the deadlock. Now we can talk about the number of defensive errors, individual defensive errors that City have made this season, because let's face it, there's been quite a few. All 3 of Birmingham's goals before the international break came about that way, and mercifully City managed to respond and get a point. But this is about not composure or not positioning. It's not about those things. It's about technique. Because if you look at the error that led to Forest's first goal, that's a swipe at the ball and a massive miss kick. Now, you can talk about pressure, you can talk about the state of the pitch, you can talk about being unsighted or being distracted by something else, but no defender worth his championship standard salt should be doing that in his own 6-yard box, surely.
It's one of those things, isn't it, as a fan who is clearly nowhere near any of these guys' standard, you can't wrap your head around, because it's not like the defender had to do anything particularly complicated. No one was asking him to play a perfectly weighted 35-yard pass, were they? They were asking him to kick the football away from where it was at that particular time. And that's something that we would all trust ourselves to do 9 times out of 10. And it's baffling, isn't it, when you see highly paid, highly coached professional footballers not do that. And I can't wrap my head around it. You can't really understand what's occurred for him to not have been able to kick the ball away.
Absolutely. There was something recently, it was talking about like some indigenous tribe who didn't understand they were about to be conquered, because when they saw ships coming towards the shore, it was so beyond their realms of comprehension that they just didn't really see it. He was a little bit like that, you know. I remember at the time thinking, what's just happened? And I've watched it replay several times, and I still don't know. My brain can't take in what happened, or just measure this distance between the attempts and the application and the occurrence. Just utterly baffling. And I think that's why I feel a little bit sorry for him, because there was a vague bit of base comedy about it, which sort of maybe cushioned the blow a little bit.
We're not going for an award this year. You don't have to come up with these weird sort of historical or mythological comparisons when it comes to...
There's other awards, man.
Yeah, fair point. Fair point. Well, it's going to be the Football Supporters Direct Federation Awards or something next year, isn't it? They've merged. You talk about the base comedy of it. The comedy really came after the ball had gone in the net, when Device tried to kick it back into the net in fury and hit the goal scorer on the head, and it went in again, and he ended up flat on his stomach as a result. After 2 or 3 seconds of cursing, there'll be 1 or 2 who actually had a quiet giggle to themselves over that.
Well, I wish I'd seen it, because I was too busy burying my head in my hands, which is fair, the default position that you adopt at City.
Yeah, that's not the default position you adopt at City when we concede a goal like that. You're normally swearing very loudly at the protagonists.
I thought your default position was in the bog having a wee.
Well, it was very cold.
Well, you can use the steam. Right, yeah. And then the second goal, once the first goal goes in, there was never really any prospect of City actually getting back into it, was there?
No, I didn't think there was any prospect even before the first goal. It just felt like it was coming.
Yeah.
You just wasn't expecting it in such comedic circumstances.
Okay, and what was it like at the end of the game? Because I know that the rain was lashing down and an awful lot of people had gone. But we talk about how low the attendance was, and they're only going to get lower, I suppose, for at least the short term, depending on takeovers and so on, which we'll come to later.
It wasn't as lashy against Forest as it was last night. I didn't really think the rain was a factor on the weekend, or the weather was it, but it certainly was last night, wasn't it?
It certainly affects when you have to walk across Walton Street car park after watching crap like that.
Don't wear suede trainers is my advice.
Okay, sound advice indeed. I'm sure everybody viewing us this evening will agree. But generally the atmosphere in the stadium at the end of the game, for what was left of the actual attendees.
We posted a photo, didn't we, on Saturday of what the ground looked like while City players were still on the field, leaving at full time. And
it looked like a reserve fixture, didn't it?
Well, the particularly poorly attended reserve fixture. It's not an exaggeration to say there can't have been more than about 200 people left when the last player, I think it was Bowen, was still off. And the fact that it was absolutely pissing it down outside, well, people would rather get outside in the rain than spend another single second in that amphitheatre of torment. So
I think the favourite moment was watching the raining down of feathers in the North Stand. That hawk that lives in the rafters of the North Stand is remarkably prolific. It did it at a game last season as well. But you look up and you think, is it snowing? No, it's not snowing. A pigeon is being expertly defeathered before being devoured, and I think
defeathered sounds like a euphemism for taking its virginity.
I thought it was deflowered. But
no, yeah, that's what
well,
it sounds like. You think the hawk had given the pigeon one before then, sort of ritually disemboweling and strangling it?
I suppose if a bird's eating a bird, it's cannibalism. So maybe there's some kind of cannibalistic erotica. Anyway, it was
auto-cannibalistic erotica.
But it was far more.
Don't put that into Google.
It was far more not safe for work. It was far more entertaining than watching the actual City game, because that just felt like a foregone conclusion.
And then 4 days later, you troop back there for the visit of Norwich, who were top of the table, and therefore, statistically at least, I don't know what you might think, having watched both teams in action, a better side than Forest. So the expectations wouldn't have been sky high, but clearly something had been instilled into the City players by Nigel Adkins, and perhaps the reaction of fans and media following the Forest game, because it was a different City.
Yeah, a lot of things felt different in the Norwich match. Firstly, we had a formation that worked, and it is hard to underestimate just how much Nigel Adkins messed that up on Saturday. That was a significant contributing factor to us looking so hopelessly poor. We had a better formation. There was definitely an improvement in attitude. I guess there is something to be said that for players wanting to bounce back and to show a little bit of professional pride. And to be honest, I don't think Norwich were as good as Forest. They might be better overall this season, but Forest played better against us than Norwich did.
Norwich looked a little bit knackered.
It's a ridiculous journey for any club to have to make, but the problem is that Norwich is such an outpost that a lot of their away trips that they're going to get, the half dozen or so that they get during the course of a season on a midweek, is going to be a pretty long journey, isn't it?
Yeah, but physically tired though. I thought Norwich looked quite tired, as if they were trying to conserve energy. They weren't really going for it, and that was useful for City because it emboldened City, and City needed that injection of confidence, I felt.
Yeah. Do you think the weather helped? Because I thought it was so bad. It was swelling, horrible torrential rain. Was it a leveller?
Possibly. I mean, was it Tribal who? He went down with cramp in something like the 60th minute, which is quite early, isn't it? And so I can only guess that's a combination of, 2 games in a few days' time and maybe heavy turf. I wouldn't have really thought the pitch looked like heavy. It was very, very trim. I noticed it looked so trim. It almost had when it was like glistening in the rain, it almost had like a slightly astroturfy look to it.
He also just had a chance, hadn't he, in front of goal where he'd stretched an awful lot, and that can cause an instant bit of muscular pain, whether it's cramp or something else. So that might have had something to do with it. But I know what you mean. I remember seeing that and thinking that it was early for a fit professional footballer to be getting cramp. I mean, City didn't create an awful lot of chances for themselves. The Henriksen shot that went over the bar was probably not as close as it looked initially.
It never looked like it was going in. A decent effort though. But
yeah.
What I will say is, because I feel I might come across as a bit unfair by saying, Norwich seemed tired and they didn't really up for it, because City played well. Relatively speaking, City looked more organised last night than they had done in a while, and there was a point where they was stringing some passes about, quite nicely, and not just, like playing it. Crab style, but they'd like move it about, and then maybe they would go back a bit if it didn't have the optimal chance, and then they'd start again. And some of that was really quite nice. It was funny, wasn't it? In terms of the conditions, Saturday was much nicer, but watching the football was torturous.
Could City have won it with a tad more ambition, do you think?
No, I won't go that far.
I don't think so. I think if we'd shown more ambition, we might have got caught. I think we probably were right to spend a lot of the match sitting in. But we had no choice. Look, it was first against 23rd.
And there were chances for Norwich to clinch it right at the end, which they didn't take. One or two that went just past the post, that you have that moment where your heart leaps into your mouth thinking, there we go again, we've lost it in injury time. And to be fair, it did have the look for a long period as of a game that wasn't going to end in a goalless draw, but was going to end 1-0 to Norwich late on.
Possibly,
yeah. Could have done.
It'd have been in some respects, it would have been harsh on City, because I thought they put as much into the game as they're able to give. They're not a very good side, but they competed with a good side. And we couldn't, after Saturday's horror show, we couldn't really ask for much more than that. Norwich might say, well, we had the better chances and more of the ball and so on and so forth, and we deserved the win. And that's also a valid argument, but ultimately they did miss their chances. And I think you need a bit of luck, don't you, when you're us, because you're probably going to get outplayed by top of the league when you're 23rd. So ultimately, I'm pleased we just made a game of it. I found myself getting strangely engaged by it, because I was just bored and cold for the first hour. And as it became increasingly evident that actually an unlikely point was there for the taking, I found myself, really quite engaged in it, and then really, really hoping that nothing bad would happen, because it sucked me in, and City's effort was... Yeah, it was good. You can't get too excited about a 0-0 draw at home, can you? But in the situation we're in, we've got no option.
It's a funny one, isn't it? Because as the final whistle went, I remember thinking to myself, quite a negative thought, 0-0 draws don't keep you up when you're 23rd. But then as you go away from the ground and you start thinking about it, you think, well, we have just got a point against the top side, a team that are quite adept at going away and scoring quite a few goals. So the more you thought about it, the better a performance is. It's just whether we build on it. It's not going to be easy because we've got 2 away games coming up now. But I thought the biggest winner of the 2 games was Marcus Henriksen. He was somebody who improved his stock more by not being present on Saturday than actually being present and playing well, because his absence looked quite stark. And he had a decent enough game against Norwich, and it was a decent enough result. Stewart's an interesting one because he had a fairly decent game last night. Now I view players on the body of work rather than one individual game, and his body of work has been shite, quite frankly. But he's given himself a platform to build upon. That was a fairly decent, tidy performance last night, and it'd be nice if we could see some more of that, given how much money we've invested.
Do we both believe that Les judges players on the body of work rather than individual games? I'm thinking about his past opinions of people like Danny Graham and Dean Marney and Jimmy Bullard and 1 or 2 others.
Are you telling me that? Are you telling me that Danny Graham's body of work doesn't warrant criticism?
No,
I only need to pick on one game.
I'm telling you that after 1 game, you hated his guts. That's what I'm saying.
If he was a country, it'd be Shatmanistan.
What about Tom Kearney?
His spotty-faced oikiness and unwarranted arrogance irritated me, because there's a man who spent 10 years cultivating a decent reputation. He's now at the point, 10 years on from his Premier League debut.
Where he's a Premier League footballer.
Where he's a Premier League footballer, and maybe you can think, maybe you actually deserve to be one. Where there was a lot of sort of, we had the first few games with Kane, and we thought, oh blimey, we may have found the replacement of Ashby. He's going to be our midfield fundament for the next few years, and then it all went to his head, and his mother became his agent and wanted loads of money, and I was pretty glad there sort of when he left.
Still,
whatever. I feel justified in everything I've said. Ever.
Kevin Stewart has been a massive disappointment, hasn't he? But he was good last night. I think he was better than just okay. I thought he was actually good, and I spent quite a lot of time watching him because I've just been fascinated to know what the manager sees in him and what anyone has ever seen in him, because he was on Liverpool's books for a long time, and you must have something about you if you're going to spend a long time at a big club like that. But I liked him last night. I thought he was quite combative. He was always trying to make things hard for the other team. I don't think you couldn't claim that his ball playing was particularly great, and there was no exciting dribbles or anything like that. But I thought he was a tidy influence in midfield, and in the way that Dan Batty's been, but better obviously. But like you say, it's one game, but it's something to build on. If he can reproduce that, and he might have to because we know how thin of options we are. But if he can just play like that, that'll do me.
Speaking of thinness of options, wasn't it surprising that we didn't bring a substitute on? Yeah, we were visibly wilting towards the end, and Norwich threw 3 substitutes on, and he just didn't respond. I found that curious.
It doesn't happen very often, does it?
What would you have done? I mean, I was trying to, when it got to about 80 minutes, I was saying to my dad, who are we going to bring on? When are we going to bring someone on? But then there didn't seem to be an obvious issue. I think you would only have done it for fresh legs, and is that
or an injury,
for a reason?
Maybe. I thought...
Because the time-wasting thing with substitutions is, people say they bring a sub on to waste time, but the referee's obliged to add 30 seconds after. But it can stop momentum, which is why people do it, even though they know that the 30 seconds is going to be added on. So a lot of it is timed, not so much because it's injury time, but because it's injury time and the opposition have got a bit of momentum.
It'd have been okay if Martin had been replaced. I thought he had a curious game. I don't know whether he just played poorly or he wasn't entirely trying. I thought his performance was worse against Norwich than it was against Forest, and there weren't many players where you could say the performance lessened.
Well, I want to ask you both a question on this actually, because we have got a thin squad, and whatever Nigel Adkins is doing wrong, one thing you can't fully blame him for is the sort of the paucity of options that he actually has. So a very simple question for you: aside from David Marshall, so we're talking purely about the outfield. Who is worth their place week in, week out at the moment?
Lehigh and Batty and Campbell are fairly obvious ones, you'd think. Bowen, because he'll score even if he's not having a stellar season.
Irvine?
Irvine's got a lot of energy, makes things happen. And, well, yeah,
After that, it's a case of who's in and out, isn't it, really?
There's no one who would have been an automatic choice for us last season, I don't think.
That's very true.
Anything further to add on those names?
No, not really. I think you've hit the nail on the head. Lehigh, Batty.
Who is worth their place, or at least who do you think is a first choice footballer if they are fit? Because obviously there are one or two injuries knocking about. But instead, I'm interested.
John Terrell's the most technically gifted player at the club.
I'm interested that neither of you have mentioned Grzycki.
Well, do you know, I was just thinking a couple of months ago that I do want to mention because Grzycki gets on my nerves and I'm quick to have a go at him. But I saw him track back and. It wasn't like a last-ditch sliding tackle or anything, but he made a challenge that stopped a cross coming in for a corner, and I just remember like blinking, trying to get the rain out of my eyes because the North Stand roof was holographic last night. But I was like, I actually saw that. That was Grzycki tracking back and making a difference. So
is there a transfer window opening soon?
Yeah, in just over a month's time.
Well, I mean, as Norwich manager said, everybody, half of Europe wanted him. What half?
Which half?
Yeah,
the
half that doesn't play football very often. Okay, Milinkovic. He was going to be in the squad last night after being the forgotten man for whatever reason it is. The word is that he's just not a very good footballer, and it's just an appalling piece of judgment to bring him into the club. But then, for him to on a day that presumably he knew in advance that he was going to be in the squad, for once, for him then to turn up late and be subject to disciplinary procedure, which includes relinquishing his place in the squad. I mean, to quote various sort of right-wing tabloid journalists, you really couldn't make it up.
Well, I mean, those are tabloid journalists with lacking imaginations, I think. I think I could make a lot of stuff up. Maybe about Milinkovic, such as what was seen in him. The guy was at Genoa, so that doesn't bode well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I mean they're a crap team, and he couldn't get in their squad, and so he made a living playing in Scotland. They were impressive credentials. I don't know. The Curious Case of Milinkovic sounds like an ESPN film in 10 years' time.
Have we ever had a curio like him in terms of a squad player who turns up at the club, presumably expecting to play regular senior football, and he's kind of hardly ever seen again? I mean, he's not injured. It's just a lack of favour with the manager who's seen him and decided, hell, he can't play properly. Has that ever happened before? I mean, we've had plenty of players like the Applebys of this world who've turned up and just haven't been fit. That's a different matter, irrespective of how much shit Richie Appleby's taken for that over the years. But this is different gravy, isn't it?
There's no obvious parallel for it, but I've got to say I'm massively with Nigel Adkins on this one. If his attitude is shit in training, which is something that gets bandied around so often, you'd have to think it's probably true. He's not. In his very, very fleeting appearances, he's not done anything to suggest that there's a great injustice being done to him by keeping him out of the squad anyway. So yeah, I'm with Adkins. I think
even with his narcissistic excesses, Kamil Grzycki's never come close to that, has he? Well, we've said, right, we're not even going to consider you.
To be honest with you, I've got Peter Halmosy in my head who didn't seem to have an attitude problem, but he was signed for big money by Phil Brown and hardly ever got picked.
Phil Brown was a bit like that though, wasn't he? The Phil Brown naughty step was a thing where he would fall out with a player for the most bizarre reasons. I once heard somebody say that he fell out with Bo Mile because he wouldn't go to Chester races with the staff because maybe just wasn't up for it. So I mean that's an odd one. Managers are funny beasts, aren't they? Steve Bruce had a couple of would sign a player, then would just sort of not use them. So there certainly is precedent, but you just can't really work out what the hell you can't work out why we signed him in the first place, apart from to just have another flesh unit present. But then he kicks somebody up in an air in an under-23s game and gets sent off.
Like Michael Keane all those years ago.
And then turns out, do we know what the excuse was? Is a dog eating his own work, or if you said like Mighton Bridge was up or something, you might be able to.
If he'd been on Castle Street today, he'd have had an excellent excuse, but unfortunately, 24 hours too late. All right, let's move on. Takeovers. We've talked a little when we've had a podcast. We've talked a little about this because there's not actually been much more than a little to talk about because it's all conjecture and speculation. But and it makes three hearts around this table sink to even think about it, but it's starting to look like the takeover that we've been waiting for might be on the rocks again.
Paul Duffin seems to have an issue doing due diligence with the people he's representing, doesn't it? This is the second time now he's represented a consortia, and it doesn't appear they've actually got the money necessary or can't prove it. And, from your own personal reputational point of view, wouldn't you want to check that yourself before you proceeded with it? I find that odd, because there was some talk previously about the Ellams sort of tapping up Duffin to sort of find potential new owners. Well, he seems pretty incompetent at it.
Don't bode brilliantly well if he does take over, although I would still very much prefer that to stay as we are. But
Paul Duffin's not going to have any financial influence if he does. He's just going to be, like he was with Bartlett, he's just going to be the face of the takeover, surely, if it does happen.
But with Bartlett,
enough
damage was done with him out, without him being the final.
That was more down to
signatory.
Bartlett just saying, that was more supposedly down to Bartlett just giving him carte blanche and Duffin spending more money than there was available. This might be a different issue.
It might, but all of the same issues that we encountered a decade ago are still pertinent issues and pertinent questions to ask. I'm starting to think it's probably not going to happen because we're 4 weeks from Christmas, which was the time at which Ehab said he wanted to get it done, and the fact that it has gone, it went very quiet, and that wasn't too much of a concern. But you can definitely hear the little hum of worry about a takeover now, and nothing that anyone says, no rumours are ever good about it, certainly not in the last week or so, and it's hard not to fear the worst. It's hard not to think that we actually are going to go into a new year, a new transfer window.
And it's going to be Nigel Adkins spending the money, whatever money there is.
Well, Nigel Adkins and Lee Darnborough have been in charge of a budget
of dream ticket.
Yeah, of somewhere in the region of nothing.
It's like the SDP all over again. Okay, City go to QPR on Saturday. First of two London trips in a row, and then it's the second one being Millwall, who were actually in action tonight. City are currently still third bottom. It's bizarre, isn't it, that City haven't actually sunk any lower as a result of what's happened over the last 4 days. That point last night was obviously very useful, and Ipswich are still rather adrift. They still haven't won at home. They could be a little bit further, certainly of Millwall, who are playing tonight. But it's still very, very tight at that bottom of the table. And again, it's a case of City winning one game and maybe one other result going their way, and suddenly they're leaping 3 or 4 places in the table. I mean, it's really hard to tell. You can tell from what you see on the pitch, but you can't tell from what you look at on the league table who are the genuinely bad sides and who's just having an inconsistent run of form.
I would say that bottom six, and that bottom six is poor, isn't it?
Rotherham down.
Millwall, City, Bolton and Ipswich, they're bad teams, all 6 of them.
Yeah, if the Football League said for the credibility of the competition we're going to relegate 6 teams and only have 18, I don't think anybody would have a moral high ground to say no. I think you should be doing that.
No. And
are you saying that you'd like to be in League One next season?
No, I wouldn't. Although there are some ground ticks. But,
that's the reason why everybody who would be in League One next season if you are looking for a positive from relegation and the first round of the FA Cup.
And back in the auto windscreens.
Yeah, whatever it's called these days. Talking of the FA Cup, third round draws on Monday. There will be ground tick opportunities aplenty, so naturally we're going to get
your hopes.
I know we're going to. Well, it's going to be Wigan at home, isn't it? It usually is, or certainly it has been on 2 or 3 occasions in recent times. Do you still like the FA Cup third round draw? I mean, do you get that sort of? Do you like the FA Cup still, and the prospect of getting of that third round tie coming the first weekend in the new year, and just whatever your woes in league football can just dissipate just for one afternoon?
I'm really rooting to Europe this season.
I wouldn't exactly call it like the panacea for all of my City-related psychological issues.
But your hopes
I still look forward to it.
But your hopes aren't high at this level, are they? I mean, you know, we have to cut our
lower than a snake's belly.
Have to cut our cloth accordingly when it comes to ambitions and expectations of City, and a decent FA Cup third round tie might be all we've got.
Yeah, no, I'll go for it. Away at some non-league shit kickers or something, or Northampton away would be my
Are Wickham still in it, Andy?
ticket. I don't even know if they're in it anymore.
I don't know if Wickham are still in it. Wickham, Hereford,
Forest Green.
Solihull Motors. That'd be a nice one.
Yeah, some proper non-league shite that City can
Lose to.
heroically scuff a 1-1 draw with someone like that. That'd be brilliant, wouldn't it?
Okay. Do you remember when we were
Chris
very...
Martin might score.
Well, if he's allowed to play. Do you remember when we played Crawley in the FA Cup a few years ago, and it was a home game, and we were all sort of slightly hoping for a replay, and ended up not even with that, even with the draw, let alone a win. We ended up losing the match, didn't we?
Yeah, I was always rather hoping that Morecambe might equalise against us when they played us here in the cup as well. So I'd get my Morecambe tick.
Well, the Mike Scotts of this world will say actually some of us went to Morecambe when they were a non-league side.
There's more than one Mike Scott. Blimey.
Yeah, there was one that used to host the Time, the Place on daytime television in the 90s.
Yeah.
There's definitely him. All right. It's the Amber Nectar podcast. Let's go back 10 years. That's where I leave the gap to fit in the commentary of the goals from the games in question, if we've got them, but Les has just decided that it's still Halloween or something.
I was doing like a time tunnel.
Is that what it was?
I thought it was a time tunnel you were
He was
doing.
reenacting the opening titles of Tales of the Unexpected. So 10 years ago, pretty much 10 years ago, 22nd of November 2008, we went to Portsmouth, and it was a cracking game of football in quite windy and wet conditions from what I remember. Memorable for quite a few isolated incidents, 3 of which involved goals. For those of you just trying to recap it or weren't around at the time, Peter Crouch gave Portsmouth the lead. Michael Turner headed an equaliser from a set piece early in the second half. And I do want to. I know it's an opposition goal, but I do want to talk about it first because it constantly comes up on greatest ever Premier League goals. That volley by Glenn Johnson that put them 2-1 up.
Yeah, keeper was off his line for that, wasn't he?
Is that the reason why it went
Should have
in?
been closed down more quickly.
Mile had flapped a little bit earlier, hadn't he, at the corner? Everything was a bit wrong, but yeah, I mean, it was an amazing controlled shot, wasn't it? I mean, Mile didn't even move, really, did, apart from to sort of like look over his shoulder as the ball nestled in the net behind him.
And we were behind that goal, and I just remember nobody swore loudly like you often do when you let in a goal by the opposition. There was just a bit of silence, and then one or two crikey sort of mild middle class, in front of school children type of exclamations, because it was just a phenomenal goal. Giovanni then hit the crossbar with a shot that was far more outrageous than the one he'd stuck in against Arsenal. An angled shot from one corner of the penalty box that went across David James and hit the angle of post and bar. So it was from one angle to another. I mean, it was the sort of thing that somebody like Giovanni probably could have done it if he'd tried, and obviously he was trying to get the ball in the net, so it wasn't an accurate shot. But by God, he didn't half welly it. It was a hell of a shot, and that was with about 10 minutes to go. So we're starting to think maybe we're not going to get the equaliser here. And then apparently Dean Windus scored.
Well, it's in the record books, Matt. And
It is.
Well, it's in the record books now, but it wasn't immediately after the game, was it?
No.
Because it was initially given as a Pamarot, however you pronounce it, own goal.
It went to committee, didn't it? And do you think that there was sentiment attached to the decision to give Dean Windus the goal then?
No,
because if you watch
no.
every angle you see, you cannot see Dean Windus, any part of Dean Windus's body, make contact with the football.
I think Windus himself said that it came off his nose, didn't he? I've always thought there was the faintest of contact, and I think in that instance you are the Premier League contentious goals arbitration panel, or whatever it called itself, was always going to side with the forward.
I think if the player propels it goalward and then the deflection doesn't stop it going, I think that's the sort of phraseology they use.
But the question mark is whether Dean Windus actually did sort of propel it forward. I mean, Harry Kane took an awful lot of stick last season for claiming a touch with his hair on a cross from one of his own teammates and therefore claiming a goal. He took an awful lot of stick for that.
Don't blame Dean Windus for claiming it. Absolutely not. I just thought the decision of the dubious goals panel was itself dubious.
Mm.
But, whatever, it's all good. It made him a record breaker, didn't it? It was Eddie Bearbank's record he took by a couple of weeks by being the oldest scorer at 39 years old.
39 years and 7 months he was at the time. Yeah. I don't know about the Eddie Bearbanks thing. I think he became the Premier League's either the oldest goal scorer or... No, I think he was the oldest goal scorer for a short period. I'm pretty certain Teddy Sheringham has got that title now. But I might be wrong, it might have been the other way around. Teddy Sheringham was 42 in 2008. He's 3 years older than Windus, and he was still playing for, I think, West Ham at the time. I might be wrong. It might have been after Sheringham. I don't know. But that made it 2-2. It was a bizarre game of football. I mean, a 2-2 draw with a brilliant goal by Glenn Johnson thrown in, and yet for a lot of it, it was a game of football slightly devoid of quality, I thought.
Yeah, I would go for that.
The England internationals, nonetheless, in the Portsmouth side, and yet still a game
well,
slightly
England
devoid
had just
of...
played Germany, hadn't they? And Defoe had gotten injured in that game, so that's why he was missing, because he was their top goal scorer. A couple of things I'd forgotten in the fug of 10 years. I'd forgotten that Tony Adams had just become their manager, because Redknapp had cleared off to Tottenham. I think if you had to say to me, list every player that made an appearance for City in that first Premier League season, I probably would have completely forget about Stelios
Giannakopoulos.
But he came on with about 8 minutes to go.
I always remember him because I think he's our only Greek, isn't he? And therefore, when you go through all the nationalities that have played for City, he's the one that comes up under Greece. That's the only reason I remember him. Actually, Halmosi came off. I mentioned Halmosi. He came off the bench that day at the same time as Windus. Notable also, Windus came on 18 minutes to go, scored a goal, and managed to get himself booked as well. Although the booking he took in the next game that we're going to talk about was far more amusing.
It'd taken a while for Dino to become involved in this season, hadn't he? And he expressed his frustration earlier because I think he'd sort of threatened to go to Leeds on loan a little bit early, but he was finally being given a bit of a run in the team. So, I suppose him getting a goal chalked on rather than chalked off a month after would help. But yeah, you're right, he didn't help his case against Stoke. Because I was wondering whether the Stoke thing was a manager-inspired tactic. But then I remembered Brown sort of chiding him and saying, well, I can't put you on now, so which would suggest it wasn't a tactic and that he hadn't wanted to put him on.
If you don't know what we're talking about, 7 days later, because we've had an international break, we've got 2 games in 8 days to talk about from 10 years ago. 7 days later, City went to Stoke and drew 1-1. Marlon King scored an angled shot from inside the penalty area right on half-time. Stoke got the equaliser with a penalty midway through the second half. What we're talking about, though, was... back then, Stoke had Rory Delap hurling in howitzers from all angles of the touchline because he was such a phenomenal exponent of the long throw art. And of course, Stoke under Tony Pulis used this as often as they possibly could. And on a wet day, if you remember, ball boys had towels for the ball so that Delap could wipe the ball and get a proper grip on it before he hurled it into the box. Now, there were a couple of occasions where Delap was getting ready to take the throw, and Windus was warming up as a substitute and deliberately warmed up right in front of where Delap was going to run to, and that got him a yellow card. Now, it's quite unusual, although not unheard of, for a substitute to be booked without actually being involved in the field of play, but Windus managed it, and I don't suppose it's happened very often
Dino
in
did
City's
get
history.
away with it once, because it was the second time he did it where the referee booked him.
He was loving every minute of it as well, because the Stoke fans behind him were giving him hell, and he was giggling as he did it.
Because the referee was quite joyless about it, really having a go at him for it. So there was a sort of inevitability that, giving it another go was going to get a booking.
But the reason I mentioned the towels is because when City were attacking the same end in the second half, I don't know whether Paul McShane was... I know Paul McShane... Yeah, no, what I'm saying is I don't know whether Paul McShane is any good at long throws, or I know he's good at everything, Paul McShane, obviously, but I don't know whether he's any good at long throws. But in the second half, he persuaded the ball boy, because the ball boys, I don't think, were told that they should give the towels to the opposition. In the event of an opponent wanting to get a grip on the football. But McShane managed to get a towel off one of these ball boys, having initially been refused, getting stick from the crowd. He wiped the ball, then wiped his armpits, then wiped his bum, and then gave the towel back to the ball boy with a massive grin. And it's the first time I'd ever seen Paul McShane smile, because if you look at photos of Paul McShane, he really doesn't smile very often, but he had a massive grin on his face as he then came forward and then presumably cocked up the throw-in. The throw-in bit itself is the bit I can't remember.
Well, as the Amber-Nectar forum thread showed, usually when Ian McShane, when Paul McShane is sort of photographed, he's normally slightly out of focus, looking aghast in the background as a goal's gone in. It's an amazing thing. It's like the thing he made from Manchester United, always being near the trophy.
David May.
David May. It's like always been relevant by being in the shot when a goal's sort of conceded.
Even though it only finished 1-1 compared to the game against Portsmouth at 2-2, this was a better game of football, which was remarkable because it was really foggy and City were wearing the Flint away kit, and you really couldn't see them for an awful lot of the game from where we were in the away end.
You are splitting hairs when it comes to deciding it was a better game of football. I thought it was pretty rank. I don't think either of them were
I thought Portsmouth was a better game.
Do you really?
Yeah, I thought it was low quality Portsmouth, but frenetic. This was a pretty joyless grind.
And Fuller dived for their penalty.
Yes, he did.
Yes,
Totally
he did.
dived.
Yes, he absolutely did.
Isn't it amazing, though, that after this game, 30th of November 2008, and City was still 6th in the Premier League? I mean, we know that there's a precipitous drop to come, but at this point, City were 8 places higher than Manchester City and 10 places higher than Tottenham Hotspur. How preposterous does that seem now? Somewhat.
It is 15 games played by this stage, 6 wins, 5 draws, 4 defeats, 22 goals scored, 24 conceded. So in the top 6, more than a third of the way through the season, and a negative goal difference, and yet still there with 23 points. But of course, I mean, Middlesbrough were about to visit, and then after that, it would go rather hideously wrong. We'll talk about that next week.